Well, welcome everybody. My name is Kirsten Vermeulen, Executive Director from the CIVIC, joined by my colleague, Jess Welser, who is also on the line and moderating today. We want to thank you for joining us for our working lunch, Creating Resilience for Your Organization and Community. We recognize that folks are somewhat crisis fatigued in a week where we have heard predictions of record wildfires for Colorado. We are still responding to COVID-19. And we're also watching from afar as brands boycott in Georgia over voting law reform. There are no shortage of crises, but what we do know is that crisis can drive change. And so that is why we are leaning into this conversation today together. We've got some extraordinary experts lined up for you. Also want to remind you of a resource that we produced in partnership with Fourth Wave Strategies, released earlier this year. It is a Planning for Resilience toolkit. And in that toolkit, you will find inspiring stories from companies, but another set of resources for you to consider in terms of your own preparedness planning for your company. In the research for that toolkit, we learned that about 44% of the funding for COVID-19 relief globally came from corporations, about $20 billion, which is incredible. We also know from our members here in Colorado that no one planned for that scale of a health crisis, nationally, locally, let alone globally. And so that is why we are leaning in even further to this conversation this year. This is the first of a couple of conversations we're going to have on this. It is in the self-interest of our companies, but also our communities to build resilience. For our smaller companies, for those that do not have a resilience plan in place, we know that 43% will never reopen when faced with a crisis or a natural disaster. So high stakes for our companies and for our communities. We have brought you the best of the best today, and the format will be a brief set of remarks from the three experts that we have lined up. Then we'll do a Q&A as a group. And then because this is a working lunch, you're going to have an opportunity to break out and dialogue with those folks. And you'll be able to choose the expert that you would like to have a conversation with. So drum roll, the folks we have for you today, we have Troy Staples, who is the Director of Preparedness with the American Red Cross. And he has over 20 years of private sector management experience, being responsible for disaster response, asset protection, and strategic life safety planning. Then we're going to hear from Tony Mendez. He is the Senior Emergency Management Specialist with FEMA Region 8, and he's a mitigation specialist with over 30 years of experience in emergency management. And then we're going to close out with Jeremy Story, who is VP of Ground Floor Media. He co-leads the media crisis communications and reputation management work there at Ground Floor. He also brings over 20 years of experience working with companies ranging from Fortune 100 to startups and also nonprofit organizations. So each of these speakers will present again for about 7-ish minutes. Then we'll have a group Q&A, and then you'll have an opportunity to break out. So I'm going to start with Troy, and then he will pass the mic to Tony, and then Tony will pass the mic to Jeremy. Take it away.
Thank you. So with the Red Cross, I think a lot of you guys know that we work in the response side of the house and recovery side of the house. You see that all over the news and the major disasters that we have. But around preparedness work that we do, a lot of people and organizations don't realize all the work we do on preparedness too. So let me back up on the response side of the house. We also respond to house fires every single day. Across the country, the Red Cross responds to a house fire every 8 minutes. That's the #1 disaster affecting North America all the time. So you always think about these big disasters, right? So we're always out there doing the smaller side. Those could be your employees, your stakeholders, your supply chain. So making sure everyone's prepared for that bad day. So around preparedness, on the preparedness work we do at the Red Cross, I like to look at it as helping our clients before they know they're our clients, right? So when a bad day happens, if we have a wildfire or tornado and people in our shelters, how can we make them better prepared to respond to, recover from any kind of emergency or disaster? So we do that a lot by all of our preparedness programs that we have. And we go into your organization and we can teach your employees to do that. So we've worked with organizations in the past, like Lockheed Martin with our active threat program and other organizations. So I'll get to that on my next slide. But we just really want to talk about making sure your employees are better prepared at home and also your supply chain preparedness. If you can go to the next slide for me, please. So I kind of want to talk a little bit more detail about our preparedness programs. You saw the link to our landing page to get more information. But basically for organizations like yours, we have three main programs that we can offer. One is our Be Red Cross Ready program. And like I talked about before, that's for your employees and your constituents that we can teach internally for you guys at your locations, in person, outside of COVID. And during COVID, we have the ability to do this virtually. And we also have our active threat preparedness program, where we go into your organization. We have 4 modules we normally do, but during COVID, we're doing our active threat program, which is more about empowering the employees and understanding what, if a first responder comes in, how that's going to look, how the lockdown is going to look, and what the people are going to do during that kind of disaster through an empowerment conversation. And then we also have our Ready Rating program, which is OSHA compliant and recognized by a lot of our partners as a really great program for small to medium-sized businesses that don't have the subject matter expertise on how to create a continuity of operations plan or emergency response plan. So we have those great tools and resources, all these for free at our website, and there's templates and everything there for those small businesses and organizations. So a lot of you have clients, supply chain people you have contracts with, and they might not have preparedness plans. So making sure your supply chain is ready and going for you, no matter what that supply chain looks like. It's a great tool and resource to have when you're signing contracts and stuff with future partners, making sure that they have preparedness plans in place. All these programs are free to anybody for the generosity of our donors. And sorry, excuse me. They're all free, and we would love to talk to you guys in your companies about having a comprehensive meeting and exploring a partnership around philanthropy and preparedness and how we can work together around that. We'll be talking about that in the breakout session. And the big thing about your organizations, I looked at the list of attendees of this meeting, is also just being an advocate for preparedness. When I started doing preparedness a long time ago, people always thought, "Ooh, preparedness is like Pandora's box. We don't want to talk about that." So we're trying to change that pendulum to why should we to why aren't we? So you guys have a great amount of influence in the community. So being an advocate out there, showing those smaller businesses, here's what it takes to be prepared. It's hard to market preparedness in your organization, right? So Red Cross has tools and resources to talk about how to market that preparedness. And just be a general advocate and telling your employees, the general public, to be businesses to be better prepared for that bad day. Because like was mentioned before, 44% of businesses will not reopen their doors, and those are paychecks, and people won't have the roof over their heads and put bread on the table for their families, and they have to move out of town, which affects that tax base in that area. So make sure your employees are prepared and you have those plans in place. Thank you for your time today, and on to you, Tony.
Thank you very much. Again, my name is Tony Mendez. I've been working for FEMA since 1992, which seems like forever, but keep our fingers crossed and I'll be able to retire soon. I want to describe a little bit about what FEMA is all about. The Federal Emergency Management Agency is indeed a federal organization at the national level. Used to be a cabinet organization, now is subsumed in part of the Department of Homeland Security. Click once, please. This is FEMA's mission. Very simple, very straightforward. We help people before, during, and after disasters. And much like the Red Cross, we do a lot of our work in response and recovery. However, the before part is super critical, and we spend a tremendous amount of time, energy, and money in partnership with state and local governments, helping them to plan, coordinate, build stakeholder relationships amongst and between the various states down to the local city and county level to make sure that they have some capabilities to deal with disasters. Click, please. FEMA really is all about providing guidance and oversight, leadership and management of federal resources. And federal resources is a sort of amorphous term. What we really do is very similar to what an orchestra leader does in Swing the Baton. but each and every one of the organizations at the state, local, federal, tribal level, as well as private nonprofits and members of business and industry, do their own thing with their own instrument. We hopefully are all reading from the same sheet of music, and the symphony comes out sounding spectacular. Sometimes if we don't practice well during peacetime, during blue sky time, things don't sound well. There's a lot of squeaking and people are a little bit off time, but we hold routine monthly and quarterly meetings with all of our federal partners, our private nonprofit voluntary agencies that are active in disaster, including the Red Cross and others, who are our normal partners, in order to try to establish networks and relationships about what we kind of expect from each other. And the practice part comes from exercise activity that FEMA does a lot of, several times a year in our region. And the states themselves actually orchestrate a number of training and exercise activities as well, focused on different hazards and risks in their communities. Click. Please click. Thank you. I mentioned this, that really what we do as an orchestra leader is try to facilitate that collaboration. But again, I want to stress the importance of blue sky or pre-disaster invitations to meetings like this, making sure that our stakeholders and networking partners know each other, understand what we do and how we do it, the rules, the limitations that we have. As a federal organizations, we've got some significant limitations. However, having said that, this last year during COVID, one of the things that has really strained the organization is every single state and tribe and territory in this nation has received a federal disaster declaration at the presidential level. And it opened up the disaster relief fund in order to pay most, if not all, of the bills associated with response to COVID. Our normal operation calls for a cost share on the part of the state and local governments of 25% and a federal share of 75%. That has been waived this year for COVID, and the federal government is picking up 100% of the costs. So whenever you hear about large vaccination sites, the cost of vaccines, infrastructure being set up, as in temporary hospitals or morgues, things of that nature, goods and services being moved around. The latest program tweak that FEMA has opened up is funeral assistance for people who have lost loved ones during this pandemic. So on and on and on. FEMA is orchestrating a huge lift this year. And not by ourselves, of course, in conjunction with the Department of Defense and all of our other emergency support functions that are basically our partners in other federal agencies and the states as well. Click again, please. One of the things that's a little bit new with regard to the current administration is a renewed and reinvigorated emphasis on equity, access to our programs, social justice, and refocusing on the concept of future conditions and potential climate change ramifications, especially along our coastlines. Flooding is the 800-pound gorilla in the room. It happens in every state in our country every single year. At some level, it may not rise to the occasion as a presidentially declared disaster, but it always happens. So stay tuned for much more emphasis in these areas as FEMA begins to flex its muscle a little bit under the current administration. Click again, please. So if your company or you individually are interested in learning more about what we do at FEMA, getting involved with us, I encourage you to get a hold of me directly. And if I don't have the answer, and I probably will not, I'm happy to direct you to the right people who do. FEMA is a very large organization, a lot of stovepipes, and most of you understand that concept where program areas don't often speak to one another. As a typical federal agency, we're pretty bad at that. But FEMA moves like lightning sometimes when compared to other federal agencies because of our mission in terms of before, during, and after disasters. The principle of building a culture of preparedness is really at the core of what we are all about. I work in the area of resilience and mitigation, and we're after trying to enable and empower communities and states to build their capacity to avoid future disasters, to build stronger, to build smarter. And the next slide, please, is my contact information. And I think that our folks at CIVIC will share this with you. I did want to bring your attention most specifically to the last two items. Ready.gov is the FEMA and federal partners version of the Red Cross preparedness page. There's more stuff there than you can imagine, and it will direct you to all parts of preparedness, planning, response, recovery, and mitigation activities that FEMA does programmatically. The last item there is a virtual exhibit space, and it's an example of one of the things that we at FEMA Region 8 in Denver are doing to be innovative and creative with our risk communications with all of our partners. We formed a partnership and collaboration with TEDx Mile High, and the most recent event was Uncharted in March, and we built a virtual exhibit space that talks about a very few parts of the things that FEMA does before, during, and after disasters. So if you have time to play around in there, I offer it for your information and edification. And I will also forward an invite for all of you to attend the next TEDx Mile High event, which is free, upcoming in June the 26th, Saturday in the evening. It is a free event, and we'll again have a virtual exhibit space there. So thank you for your time. I appreciate it. And Jeremy Story will chat now from Ground Floor Media. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Tony. I appreciate that. Tony and Troy have provided a lot of valuable information, and it's largely focused on the operational response to a crisis situation. In that operations response is obviously critically important, but I also want to spend a few minutes discussing a response component that's also important, and that's the communications response. And I spend my time working with crisis clients really in three ways. First, helping them develop or test a crisis plan. So someone comes to us and says, we're worried about a data breach and we don't know how we would respond. Can we work with you to help develop how that response would look like? And so we do that with them. And then the second way is that we respond to an active crisis situation. And that can either be a client who we worked with to develop the crisis plan, now needs to execute that plan because their fears came true. Or more often, we'll get a phone call from a lawyer in town that we know that says, I've got a client who has a situation and they need your help. And then we start working with them immediately. And then the third way, and this is the one that's most overlooked by our clients, is recovering from a crisis once that crisis has subsided. So it may be that something bad happens and people are really focused and connecting your brand to that bad situation. And even after the crisis ends, they still think about that crisis as the first thing when they think about your brand. And so our job is to conduct a marketing campaign or a PR campaign to try to move them beyond that and get people thinking about something different than that crisis is the first thing that they think about with your brand. So if there's one piece of advice that I could give you here today, it would be to create or update your crisis plan. And a lot of people don't know where to begin. They become paralyzed if they don't have a crisis plan because they think it's overly complex and they're just not sure where to start. And the reality is that you can really start in a simple place, and that is look around your organization, find somebody in each department, HR, legal, marketing, operations, bring them together and just brainstorm the things that could go wrong. And you can prioritize that list of things that could go wrong. And from that, you can begin to build a response to how you would handle those things. Once you understand your vulnerabilities and you're really honest about what your vulnerabilities are, that's a really important step, because you can then start to build the plan of how you would respond. And at a most basic level, identify the people who need to be part of the response. There are times when people who don't have a crisis plan are trying to respond to something, and it can be 8 hours into the response and you realize that somebody who should be part of that is not there. And now you've got to track them down and bring them in. And everything you've done to that point has been missing a really important lens. So think about who needs to be involved, and you can just build it from there. It doesn't have to be overwhelmingly complex. It doesn't have to be really fancy. It can be bare bones, and it can be a framework for how to respond more than a plan that identifies every single contingency and how to respond to it. So just take that first step and think about how you might respond to it. So with that, I thought it might also be helpful to share some of the most common mistakes that I see when organizations are responding to a crisis. And you can see on this slide, the first one is that they respond too slowly. And that's really born out of two things. One is wishful thinking, that if we ignore a problem, it may go away. Extraordinarily unlikely that it will go away. So better to deal with it rather than just let it grow. And then the second is just no established process for how to respond, and that slows everything down. And I've had the experience of Fortune 100 companies and really small nonprofits or startups that have all said the same thing when a crisis is over, which is, I can't believe how quickly it moved. And there have been situations where they're dealing with one issue. It might be, how are we going to communicate to customers, and what are we going to say to them? And you're bringing in legal, and you're bringing in sales, and you're finally arriving at a decision. And you get done and you want to pat yourself on the back, and you turn around and realize that 4 more problems have now stacked up. You've lost ground. So being able to move quickly is critically important. The second thing that is a mistake that organizations commonly make, and that is forgetting about their employees. The reality is that employees could very well be the most important audience you have in a crisis. You need to treat them the same way you would treat your customers. There are a lot of executives, particularly highly paid executives, think that because they're giving a paycheck to an employee, you have bought their loyalty. That is not how it works. You can win their loyalty by how you treat them, but I can tell you that a paycheck is just a paycheck, and it's not going to buy the loyalty of employees. So you need to think about them as an important audience, as the brand ambassadors that they are, and treat them with the same care and thoughtfulness you would treat your customers. And then the last one is around social media. Too many companies don't appreciate the risk that social media poses, whether you're on social media or not. The reality is that there has never been an easier way for a few disaffected people to bring pain to your organization than through social media. They can go viral, and it is chaos theory sometimes about which situations go viral and which don't. But the reality is that they have the ability to organize and find other people and get traction based on how compelling their story is on social media. And you'd have to know that it's happening. One of the things that used to be true is that when the Denver Post published an article or CNN aired a story, that was when the crisis work began. The reality today is that by the time the Post or CNN has the story, we've known about it on social media for days or even weeks. And that's the culmination of it. That's not the beginning of it. So recognizing and monitoring social media to understand what's coming is critically important. It is not uncommon today. 9 News is really good about this. Jeremy Hohola, Chris Vanderveen, they will float things on social media to see what kind of reaction it gets. And if something really resonates with people, they get a lot of interaction and engagement, they'll do a story on it. So they might see something that's happening in another market and wonder if it's relevant to Denver. And then post something. And in the comments, they'll also identify sources for the story. So the power of social media to predict what's coming is really, really powerful. Don't underestimate that. Next slide, please. So then in terms of the business case for the crisis plan, I talk about the response triangle. You've got legal, you've got operations, and you've got communications. All 3 are really important to making sure that an organization survives. Legal, it's pretty obvious. You don't want to get sued out of existence. Operations is important too, because you need to be able to maintain, your business operations so that you can still have a product or service to offer. And then communications, you want to maintain trust with your partners and your customers so that you don't have product that no one wants and you go out of business because of that way. All three of these are really critical, and they've got to work together. And so as you're responding to a crisis, thinking about all of those, working side by side with the same goals and objectives is really important. Next slide, please. And then in terms of the business case for the crisis plan, just a couple of data points that I wanted to share. And you'll find data all over the place, and sometimes they're sliced and diced a little bit differently. But PricewaterhouseCoopers, PwC, had a crisis survey this year where they talked to business leaders, and 95% of them said that they expect to face a crisis within 2 years. And the same number, I don't know if it was the exact same 95%, but 95% also said that they really weren't prepared for that their crisis management capabilities need improvement. So that is the paradox of crisis communications. It's coming, you know it's coming, and you still aren't taking the steps that you need to prepare for that. And that's really just born out of frustration in some cases, where it's a hard thing to try to get everything aligned and pulling in the same direction, even when you know that it's coming. It's like convincing a kid to eat broccoli. It's in their long-term best interests, but it's not in their short-term most fun interests. One of the things that we see is in the next two bullet points, where a majority of people say they have a crisis plan, but when you look at it, less than half of them will say that it's up to date. And that can be a real problem, because you might pull a crisis response plan off the shelf and it may be out of date. And out of date can mean a lot of different things. It might mean that people who are assigned responsibilities are no longer there. We actually had one where a business had introduced a new division, which had actually become the biggest division, and it wasn't even reflected in the plan because the plan was created before that division was created. And so really the biggest threat to their company wasn't even mentioned in the crisis plan. So making sure that not only you have a crisis plan, but that you're conducting reviews of it periodically, and tabletop crisis drills is a great way to do that, to identify what has changed and what needs to be updated in the plan. And then, Kirsten, I think, mentioned, the fact that the impact of crises can be devastating. We talk about the 6 and 6 rule, which is 6 in 10 businesses experiencing a data breach specifically end up shut down within 6 months. And the US SBA talks about 90% of companies fail within 2 years of being struck by a disaster. So what you find is that some organizations come out of the immediate crisis and thinks we've made it, not recognizing that a fatal blow has been dealt and that you won't recognize it for a period of months or even years, because either you've lost trust of people, or you've lost market share that's going to be catastrophic eventually, or you've lost the faith of your own employees because of the way that you handled that. So the one thing I would say is, as you're talking about this internally in terms of making the business case for a crisis plan, I would argue to CFOs and COOs and CEOs that a crisis plan offers one of the strongest ROIs possible that they will ever see. That the investment is in time, and there is some money investment into it, but it is extraordinarily small in terms of how it can protect the business if something catastrophically wrong were to happen. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Kirsten, who's going to talk a little bit about how we're going to do the breakout rooms, I believe.
Excellent. Yeah, and I think we're also going to bring back Troy so he can participate in a quick group Q&A. And feel free to drop your questions in the chat. We've got a couple here. Yeah, welcome back. So we know that one of the chief recommendations that came out of our research with fourth wave strategies for our resilience planning toolkit is that it's important, as you mentioned, in these blue sky times, to build relationships with local partners, so that when it comes to rolling out the execution of your plan, you have those connections, those relationships in place. And so wanted to hear from each of you all, what would be your recommendation for this blue sky time for folks to make a connection with you? What would be meaningful for their organizations in that first step? Any thoughts on that?
You say the question again, I'm sorry.
Sure, you bet. So we want to encourage our companies and organizations in this resilience planning timeframe to build relationships with local partners. So that may be nonprofits that they can partner with in terms of relief response, but also thinking about the folks we've got on the call here today, who are the experts in that response and recovery phase. How can they reach out to you to take that first step to build a relationship with your organization to help build their plan and to ensure that they're ready when response time comes? What would be the first step in your recommendation?
Well, for the Red Cross, Ben Gasway is on here too. So I suggest reach out to Ben and myself so we can help you out with preparedness efforts and philanthropy efforts with your organizations for internally. And we would love to work with you guys on that so you can help your employees and your supply chain and everybody you have contact with. Then when it comes to community partners, a lot of it is, like I was saying before, is being an advocate out there and have a voice out there to make sure all these small businesses and everyone's better prepared, because a lot of them don't have time, right? They don't have the subject matter expertise. They're trying to keep the doors open and their rent paid and their payroll done. So by these organizations on this call today is showing them what normal is and why they need to be doing this, and like I said, being those advocates is going to help out that whole community. And there was a conversation in the chat about stuff going on in the mountains for fires, right? So that's another way to be an advocate, is reaching out to those businesses or talking about that, or doing a press release, or talking to that local media market and saying, hey, here's why we're prepared as an organization. Here's why our employees are prepared. So in those smaller towns and those other communities are in that wildland urban area interface where fires can happen, they're seeing that these other business organizations, that preparedness is normal. We do this all the time. So helping out those mountain communities doing that. And then around your supply chains too, the local businesses around you. If your supply chain isn't prepared, you have an issue, then you have that problem there too. So, and then lastly, depending on the size of your business, is we call it a memorandum of understanding or memorandum of cooperation. So if there's an issue going on with your building and you can't access your building because of an active threat situation, or the furnace is out in the middle of winter, or whatever it might be, is how can you keep your goods and services flowing? Work with another partner. So if you're on this call and you have an office in the tech center and someone else has an office downtown, have a reciprocal agreement ahead of time. So downtown you can't get there because of a civil disturbance or something, you're sharing office space in Centennial in the tech center, so your people can still go to the office and your goods and services and your meetings with people can still go on.
This is Tony again. If I could chime in here a little bit. FEMA works in conjunction with all levels of government: city, county, state, tribal, other federal agencies. And I would recommend that the first place that a business should touch is the city and or county emergency manager where your business resides. Every city that's of any size and every county has one. And you can Google that and find it at FEMA.gov. In addition, we work with an organization of business and industry contingency planners called the Colorado Rocky Mountain chapter of the Association of Contingency Planners. And they are about keeping the lights on and the doors open and the data flowing and the money flowing and the products moving for business and industry. They meet every month on the second or third Friday of the month. I don't know exactly. You can Google them as well, CRMC-ACP. A great organization. They speak fluent business. That's their job, right? These guys and gals are all about keeping the business open during times of crisis and whatever kind of crisis, whether it's something that governments get involved in or not. And they do training and they host meetings at each other's companies and create networking opportunities to learn. Additionally, local governments and the state of Colorado's Office of Emergency Management and FEMA all have training opportunities, including free online independent study training courses in a whole host of topics and activities, ranging from individual preparedness and planning and creating a disaster kit, all the way up to animals in a disaster And being an incident commander on a fire and public affairs and logistics and everything in between, the FEMA.gov website is packed full of stuff like that. But again, I'm happy to help people decode all that and find what you're looking for.
Hey, Tony, can you also mention about the state BOC, the Business Operations Center they created at the state level for businesses?
Right, and I'm not really familiar with that. I'm sorry, Troy. If you know more, you ought to just go right ahead.
Okay. Yeah, so the state of Colorado has an emergency operations center that the Red Cross and FEMA all have a seat at. So when a disaster happens, it's a preset determined emergency operations center for responses. Each jurisdiction has one, and the state does for these big wildfires, so we can all work together. And we realized over the course of time here in Colorado that the businesses who own actually 85% of the infrastructure, the tools and the resources in the time of disaster, aren't at the table. So when a big disaster happens, we need to work with these businesses that own, like Excel Energy, that has all the trucks and all these other businesses. They're not at the table making these decisions on recovery and response because we're going to be calling them. So there's a business operations center at the state of Colorado, and I get you the contact over there. So you can let them know you want to be part of that team. You won't have a seat actually in the emergency operations center, but that person will contact your organization with the tools and resources you might be able to bring and negotiate that ahead of time. So when a big disaster happens, you have a seat at the table, you know what's going on, and your goods and resources and talents that your organization might have might be able to help the state or the local jurisdiction in a time of crisis or emergency.
That's an excellent point, Troy. And we do have a couple of folks actually from Excel on the call today. So perhaps they'll join you for breakout and learn a little bit more about that seat at the table. Clearly, collaboration is key. And each of you have mentioned engaging employees. We have just about 2 minutes left, so this may be a rapid fire before we transition to our breakouts. But if there was one engagement opportunity, you've mentioned training, but in addition to training, in terms of engaging employees to collaborate with their company, to prepare and to plan for resilience, what would that one thing be?
I would suggest having each employee build a disaster plan and a disaster kit for their home. Takes into account your financial documents, all your insurance, food and water, your pets, your kids, what to do, where to go, similar to the reciprocity agreement that was mentioned earlier between businesses. Because if the employees are worried about their home, they're not going to be able to come to work and do their job. So you got to take care of home first. It's the epitome of the topic of work-life balance.
And that's what we teach in that Be Red Cross Ready class that we can do for any of your organizations. Then on top of that, to add to that is also communicating with your employees and practicing that, right? So in a time of crisis, if you're in lockdown, that there's an active threat at your building, how do you keep everybody out in safe distance? So practice that internal communication plan so everyone can be safe at home. If there's a blizzard, there's a chemical spill, so those employees are better prepared at home. And if there is a disaster, how you can track those employees during a time of crisis so you can be there to support them if needed. So there's a way to do that.
Excellent. Well, it is time for us to transition to our breakouts. So we will have you pre-curated in a breakout, and this will be led by our committee members who have helped to curate today's conversation. So you'll have an opportunity to connect with them as well. If you're in a breakout that is not your preferred, feel free to jump into another conversation. No one will be offended. This is your time to learn. So we're going to head into breakouts, and then we'll come back and close out as a larger group and share some of those resources with y'all. Enjoy the conversation.
Welcome back, everyone. I'm Jess Walzer with CIVIC, and I just want to say I hope you found those breakout rooms informative, and hopefully it helped you think about how you personally and at your organization you can be a little bit more prepared this year and beyond. Just a few quick updates from us, and then we'll let you have the rest of your day back. Thank you, Troy, Tony, and Jeremy, once again for sharing your expertise and insights. We will be sharing out the resources you've mentioned, as well as a recording and upcoming events with you in a follow-up email, so be on the lookout for that. Later this year, members, we will be planning a second disaster response event during the anticipated disaster season. So just so you know, keep that on your radar, and we will be planning that and sharing it out. In the interim, we'd welcome you to engage with us with some of our upcoming events. Tomorrow we have two, one for the Civic 50 Colorado and the second as part of our Virtual Voices series, Overcoming Denial and Resistance, Tools to Have Meaningful Race and Equity Conversations. At the end of this month, the summit RFP will be closed. So if you or somebody you know is interested in hosting a 60-minute workshop at our annual conference, that'll happen in late October, please do fill that out. For some of our small business members, we welcome you to join us May 6th for our first Small Business Quarterly Roundtable. It'll be an opportunity for you to connect with your peers and also talk about timely topics relevant right now. May 20th, we'll have another webinar in our Virtual Voices series, Putting Your Power Where Your Mouth Is. It'll be another great one, and we welcome you to join us there for this community series. And then on May 27th, we'll have another one of our CSR peer roundtables for members. We will be having events on partnerships, employee engagement, and so many other great topics coming soon. So please be on the lookout for those. We thank you once again for sharing your day with us today and hope that you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thanks everyone and take care.